Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time poor but enthusiasm rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Matt Stone. Hi, Matt. How are you?
I'm really well, Kieran. Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
No, my pleasure. And I know that lots of people, I've been talking about how much I've wanted you to come and talk to me about coaching for a long time. So they'll be really happy that I've finally managed to get around to it.
No, I appreciate it. It's really exciting to have the invite, and I'm glad we can make it work.
I think most people, like I said, will be familiar with your work, but I wonder if you wanted to tell us a bit about who you are and how you got here.
Yeah, sure. So, my name's Matt Stone. Currently, I am Director of Education with Teaching Walkthroughs. That means that I head up the training and consultancy support that we offer our members. So I'm in school a lot, working with senior leaders, but coaching teachers, groups of teachers, individual teachers, getting into lessons and seeing what's happening in classrooms. That's the real highlight of it. Do a bit of writing and resourcing for the toolkit as well, producing content and materials to support schools who are implementing walkthroughs based programs. And then kind of in the background, as you mentioned earlier, I do a little bit of speaking around the research ed scene. Really passionate about coaching and supporting teachers through professional development and professional learning opportunities. And that's what I tend to spend a lot of my time talking about and thinking about.
I think there are probably fewer people who think as carefully and as deeply as yourself about coaching. And I'm always fascinated when I see it research in or when I see like different things that you release. And so I thought I would try and ask you some questions about a talk you did in Warrington, which was way back in March, I think.
Yeah.
And my first question, I suppose, is what are your guiding principles for coaching? Nice broad one to start.
So at Warrington, in fact, at the last couple of research ed events, where I've spoken about professional vision, really it's under the caveat of discussing the purpose of coaching. So the premise really of that talk is there's an awful lot out there around, particularly currently, there's a lot out there around what coaching should and shouldn't look like. So what I would probably describe as the process of coaching, how to coach. The talk that I've been rolling out of the research ed events is it's more about why do we coach? What's the purpose? What's the point of doing it? And actually, the more I dig into coaching, and it's a big part of the work that we're currently doing our walkthroughs as well. The more purpose comes to the forefront, where you can go quite far in terms of implementing a successful or useful coaching program if there's a really clear understanding of why you're doing it in the first place. And for me, that comes down to developing the teacher's future responsiveness, their capacity to see the classroom in a really nuanced and detailed way, for them to notice things that are important. That people talk a lot about adaptive teaching and responsive teaching. And when you break that down, actually it comes down to you've got to see those things first. You've got to be able to look across the classroom and see what's happening, see what students are doing in order to respond in an appropriate way. And I think that's a challenging thing. And so when we talk about the purpose of coaching, when I talk about the purpose of coaching, I'm talking about the idea of supporting that process. So building the teacher's capacity to be able to see things in their classroom that are important, to build their repertoire of teaching techniques that enable them to respond to the thing they've noticed so they can be adaptive and responsive in the classroom. And the real key is that they're going to do that forever when you're not there. So the big kind of driver for purpose for me is the 99% rule. It's like there's no statistics to back this up. This is a made up figure, but like teachers are on their own for 99% of the time in the classroom, making their own decisions, doing their own thing. Nobody's there to help them. The coach isn't there. The senior leadership aren't there. And so what we do in coaching and what we do in professional development has to stick. The purpose is that when we're not there, the teacher's in a better position to see and deal with the things that are happening in the classroom than they were before the process started. So that's a big thing for me, is great coaching should be driven by a clear understanding of the purpose, what we're trying to get out of it, and not just what I see sometimes for various reasons, schools pretending to coach. So we employ a language of coaching. We talk about things as if that's what's happening, but the reality is we're just going through the motions. you know, and sometimes there's a tendency to try and repair teachers, to kind of go into a classroom and see a lesson, and you're trying to fix what you've seen as opposed to thinking about what happens next. I don't know about you, Kieran, but I go through if I think back on my teaching career, I was in the classroom for 16 years before I came out to do this role, and I kind of feel that most of the feedback I ever got was about that moment in the lesson. It's like, this is what was seen, and this is what the observer felt was missing. So this is what's going to happen next. And I suppose the challenge with that is that moment's gone. It's like hitting a bad shot on a golf course. It's like you can't go back and hit it again. You've got to think about the next time I'm in that position, how am I going to deal with it differently? And so I feel that purpose is the number one guiding principle.
It's interesting you mentioned the 99%, because I almost in my time working with teachers, I noticed almost like because we're tired, because we're busy, there's almost like this slippage back to default.
Yeah.
And your aim is to make that default that reasonably effective or highly effective mode of operation. Do you think that the purpose goes a long way to preventing that, or is it high quality coaching over a longer period of time? Well, have you experienced that before yourself?
I think it's a great point. So what you see when the purpose isn't transparent or where it's misaligned is you see a speed camera teaching. So you see teachers who change their plan or change their approach because Kieran's just walked in through the door and there's a need to be seen to be doing things. And I think that's a real challenge. And what I will say is I find there's a large part of that is unavoidable. It's human nature, because a teacher might have been working hard on something and it's only natural to want to showcase what you've been working on. And so there's a cultural thing there. First of all, you have to get the culture right where everybody knows that we're doing this thing because we want to make things better for the children in the end. So of course it relies on a long-term successful coaching program to help that to kind of come to fruition. But I say, yeah, how do you avoid that kind of that change in behavior, that kind of change of dynamic when the coach walks through the door? How do you know that when you leave the classroom or the coaching conversation ends, that the teacher's going to go and choose to do that thing? And what you mentioned is spot on. The teaching is so busy that it's often driven by heuristics, and we work on autopilot. And so it's how do we make a habit of those things that we're working on, so they're not just one-offs or they don't become labored. They become the thing that the teacher chooses to do rather than the thing they were doing previously. And I think that's a role of coaching. So I think where some professional development maybe falls short at times is sometimes even if we notice the thing that needs to change or the thing that will be useful, it's another thing then to actually support the teacher practically and socially over time to make a habit of the solution. And that for me is the role of coaching. It's the things that happen between diagnosis and the end goal that enable the teacher to actually work on habitualizing the solution. And I think it's probably sensible to say that time scale is hugely variable, depending on who the teacher is, where their current practice is, what the change looks like, what the barriers they're facing might be, the complexity of the solution. Like we talk a lot about kind of breaking down techniques. So see, for those who know walkthroughs, it's a toolkit that takes teaching techniques and breaks them down into 5-step guides. But the real logic of that is that it's hard to work on complex techniques. It's hard to habitualize them when you take them as a whole, when you take the whole thing, say this is a sum of many parts, and suddenly we just want to be able to do it. And it doesn't always work. It doesn't work like that. But some are more complex than others. And so, yeah, you have to have that rhythm of support in place that enables teachers to habitualize the solutions that they're working on in a way that they own them and that they can, as you mentioned, become the default that they turn to when they recognize that situation arising again in their classrooms.
You mentioned the quality of feedback you received. I mean, I think we must have been in the game roughly the same amount of time. So obviously, at the when we were forged in the fire of Ofsted wants, feedback wasn't, about actual elements of your practice. It wasn't necessarily on the agenda. Do you reckon your experience in the sort of the early to mid 00s has influenced how you want to support teachers now? Because I know for me, that's definitely a big driver.
Yeah, I think it's 100% the case. So for me, like there's quite rightly so, and I think I've enjoyed being involved in coaching at a time currently where there's so much to learn from so many great people, and sometimes that causes disagreement and discussion at a level of like, this is coaching, this isn't coaching, it shouldn't be like that, it shouldn't look like that. I'm a bit more like you, I guess, where I kind of come over like, as long as it's not that, as long as it's not what it was, like there's a common sense element here. So yeah, I am a bit of a purist when it comes to coaching because I feel like I've researched it and done a lot of thinking about it. And so I have my views on what I think works and what it should look like. But I'm still very much like, there's a common sense element to taking a coaching stance. If we define coaching as being the support for teachers practically and socially to enable changes in their practice. And then when we compare that to, as like you're describing there, what used to happen where it was just like, here it is, do it. This is what I think. That just doesn't work. It doesn't work. And so when I got into senior leadership, I mean, I certainly as a head of English and as a middle leader, but then when I had the opportunity to kind of shape professional development in school, that was my starting point, if I was honest. It wasn't like, God, I need to get stuck into instructional coaching and this is the way forward. That doesn't work. We need to think about something different. And there's a common sense approach here that says we have to help teachers to do the things we want them to do, or we have to help them solve the problems that they're facing in their classroom. We can't just tell them to change them. And that's still, it's a difficult shift for lots of schools there. I still see lots and lots of schools who are at different stages when it comes to kind of shaping the culture around that, where it's a big thing to let go of. If you've always graded lessons, if you've always kind of run formal reviews, if you've always given feedback, it becomes the expectation that that's what a senior leader does. And on both sides, so sometimes you sit down with a teacher and you want to take a coaching stance to the dialogue, but the teacher has only ever known being told what the observer thinks, and they kind of look at you and they expect and invite you to just tell me what you think. It's like, and it takes a lot to kind of create a system that enables coaches and observers the confidence to say, there's no, I'm not going to tell you what I thought, but let's talk about what we've seen. And I think that's a big shift for me. That's I think I've digressed a bit there, but it's absolutely a reaction to my own experiences. I do think it's important to point out, if I can, that I worked with some brilliant senior leaders when I was starting out as well, and there wasn't malintent behind delivering ropey CPD or ropey feedback. It was well intended, but just a little bit naive in terms of what the impact would be. And of course, there's those external pressures from the inspectorate and in Wales as well, the kind of consortium model which hovers above schools. It's like there's an expectation that you can prove it, prove that these learning walks took place or these observations took place, prove how you know which teacher is where and what they do. And there's a big shift there that I see happening in the work that I do. where that kind of culture is kind of fizzling out a bit, I think, now, and being replaced by something that is a little bit more productive around helping teachers, supporting teachers to do a really difficult job.
Senior leaders back then were probably having to be, where you got the umbrella analogy, where they're protecting their teachers from a lot of the stuff. I think there was a lot of stuff to protect schools from, and one of the things you couldn't get right was the fact that you were going to be graded. Your lessons were going to be graded whenever the inspector came in, so they're going to have a 10, 15-minute snapshot, and so you can totally see the reasons why. But I'm really glad we have sort of grown up through a time of challenge, respectful challenge towards authority, and actually the authority in the main have seemed to listen to quite a lot of things that have had to be said.
And people know what they know. That's the big thing for me is people don't, I've never met a senior leader, and this is only my experience, so I'm sure they exist, but I've never met a senior leader who doesn't want to help teachers, who doesn't want their teachers to succeed, who doesn't want the students to succeed. In the same way, I've never met a teacher that doesn't want their students to do well. It's like everybody wants to do it, but it's about harnessing that kind of mutual ambition to do well for the students, for the teachers. It's harnessing that and being brave enough to actually put systems in place that helps that happen, rather than hoping it happens, talking about it. And, I probably, you had a similar experience. Like, I remember sitting in an inset day in September and having the teaching and learning lead kind of introduce, this is what we're going to be doing, this is what we want everyone doing. And it was hard to see the relevance from my practice at the time, and B, it was like, and then we're going to come round in a month's time and just check that you're doing it. That was it. It's like thumbs up, thumbs down. Is everyone going to do this thing? And then we're going to come round and we're going to see that you're doing it. And oh no, nobody's doing it. Why is nobody doing it? It's because nobody knows how. Nobody knows how to do it. Nobody's really kind of forged that mental model around what the actions look like. What does that thing look like in my classroom, with my children, and my curriculum? It's very different at the front of the training room. We wonder why those things they never get done, do they? It just drags on. Then it's like, so there's an efficiency to I think the emerging approaches as well around, small changes deliberately enacted regularly and frequently, but seen through so that they actually land in the classroom. I think that's the key thing.
I can only imagine that must have been amplified in secondary, given that at least if someone's telling me something in September in primary school, there's a fair chance it's going to apply to at least one of the subjects I'm going to teach. But if your specific subject, I know Craig Barton always talks about how here's the general idea, but I can't tell you how it works in history, geography, etc.
Yeah, and listen, that's a massive challenge for coaching as well. Like, so I think for any PD, and we're kind of in the firing line with this a little bit because walkthroughs is subject generic. It's they're general principles of teaching techniques, and that works well in the sense that the teacher is the expert. So in secondary, when I'm coaching secondary teachers, I'm not always coaching English teachers. My expertise is in English teaching, but I can coach a science teacher. I can coach a Welsh teacher or a French teacher because they're the experts in the subject knowledge. And my job is to help them see where this thing fits and how it would help them. But they have to own it. They have to modify it and personalize it. And that's why the follow-up discussions are so important. Like, if you present a technique, if you present process questions to a body of staff who represent 11 different subject domains, that's going to look different in every classroom, in every subject area, but also with different classes as well. Like, if I'm teaching that to a year 7 or if I'm teaching a year 11, it's going to look different. And so teachers need time and support to think deeply about the technique, about where it fits, to make modifications that are appropriate to the context. And that hasn't happened historically because the systems haven't been there. I think that's fair to say. And that's what really excites me about schools who invest in building a realistic and sustainable coaching program, is that it enables teachers to actually take their time to work on those solutions, to personalize them, to modify them, to adapt them so that they make sense. And that goes back to what we were saying earlier on. Part of that is the practical social support side, that means that there's a greater chance the teacher's going to enact that technique or have a go at that technique when you're not there. And so I think that's a really important part of it. And it is a bit of an elephant in the room. I remember hearing Josh Goodrich talk about this a few years ago, actually, on a virtual research ed, I think it was. He was talking about kind of the evidence for and against subject-specific coaching and pedagogy generic coaching. And I think it's fair to say, right, in an ideal world, you'd probably want subject specialists coaching subject specialists. I think that seems natural. It seems sensible because you can have a much more in-depth dialogue around curriculum. But going back to kind of guiding principles of coaching, building great coaching in schools, is it's got to be realistic and sustainable. And that's just not realistic in British schools. It's not realistic to have an arts coach and a woodwork coach and a French coach. And, many schools only have one teacher. They have like departments of one, so you just can't do that. And so you've got to make the best of what is possible. And so I think acknowledging that's a barrier, acknowledging that solutions need to be contextualized to the domain in which they're going to be used, supporting the teachers to do that, I think enables you to use kind of generic pedagogical approaches as part of a productive coaching cycle.
Like you say, the expertise. Once you then develop an awareness of the strategy that might be combined with that, it almost opens up this next layer of thinking where you think, well, how do you use this?
And it's where it's how do you unveil that next layer of teaching? And that's where those kind of traditional ad hoc cycles of professional development kind of fall down. Is you've got a teacher fired up about the technique and they want to use it, but they never have the chance to discuss how it might be used in their context. And so it never gets used. It never happens, or if it does, it gets kind of maladapted into something that doesn't necessarily serve the purpose. And so you've got to make that happen. And that's exactly, it's a challenge, but that's absolutely key to it, I think.
A few weeks ago, I spoke to Nick Pointer, and he very eloquently, as he does, explained the importance of teachers drawing on issues. And actually, you started to touch on this, drawing on the issues from their classrooms. But some of the research suggests that teachers can tend to describe classroom events in naive and limited terms. Is there a way to overcome this?
Yeah, I mean, so the noticing part, the awareness, the seeing things in the classroom. So I hope that's what Nick is alluding to, the idea to kind of draw on prior experience and apply that to kind of the kind of live problems. I mean, that obviously is part of the goal of coaching, but what we know is that noticing in any domain is knowledge dependent. So there are lots of great examples of this. I use some silly examples in some of my talks, like ranging from anything from like optical illusions, where like the heads and the candlesticks, and you kind of, and you could put that on a screen and half the class will see the heads, or half the room will see the heads and half will see the candlesticks. And until you actually point out, here's the thing, here is the candlestick. And then people, oh yeah, I can see it now, but I couldn't see it before. I couldn't bring it to the forefront. And so you have this kind of the kind of perception theory at play, where things are difficult to see if you don't know about them. And we sideline what we don't know about. And when we're looking and studying a scene, we tend to kind of notice the things that make sense to us cognitively. So another example I often use is in my spare time, I play a bit of golf and use lots of golf examples in my talks. And if I was to look at a lovely coastal image, and you've got the sea, you've got cliffs, and you've got lovely kind of greenery on top, but there's a golf course on top. I'm immediately drawn to the golf course because it's what I'm interested in, it's what I know about, and I start to think and imagine what it would be like to play that golf hole. But somebody who has no interest or knowledge about golf is looking at it and thinking, God, that scenery is amazing. Look at that cliff. Look at how that goes. And if you're a geographer, you're thinking about coastal erosion and chalk face of the kind of headland. And so we see what we know about, right? So that's the first part here, is that noticing things is knowledge dependent. So we have to build in that acknowledging to our coaching program, professional development. And so there are lots of ways to do that. So the other kind of part that you mentioned there was around Kathleen Sturmer's work. I think I kind of touched upon this in one of the research ed talks. So she wrote with her colleagues in Germany, I think it was around about 2013, a paper called Changes in Professional Vision. So professional vision is the theory that I've been working on from Charles Goodwin. I'll probably talk a bit more about that later on. And Kathleen Sturmer applied that specifically to pre-service teachers. So around about 106 pre-service teachers. And she measured their professional vision, measured what they could see in the classroom. And it was a bit kind of rudimental in terms of, a bit crude in terms of how she did it. But essentially it was like a shadow boxing approach. So she took a load of new teachers. She taught them a little bit about 3 core domains in teaching, 3 core ideas around teaching. So things like goal clarity. So do all of the students have, absolute clarity around what they're meant to be doing? I think it was teacher support. So does the teacher provide adequate support for the students in their learning? And what is the learning environment like? What's the learning climate like? And she asked students the pre-service teachers to rate, using lots of video clips, to rate what they saw, the effectiveness of what they saw in these video clips. And they compared the pre-service teachers' responses to an expert response, so experts' responses, and kind of explored the differences around 3 areas. So she looked at the ability to describe what was happening accurately. So how well can can teachers describe what's happening in the classroom? How well can they explain the reasons why certain things might be happening? And how well can they predict the impact of teaching approaches or key moments, key learning in the classroom? So those 3 key areas is what Sturmer describes as knowledge-based reasoning domains. So she looked at description, explanation, and prediction. And what she found was that those expertise in those areas are malleable. So whereas, as you'd expect, novice teachers might enter the profession and, as you said, their ability to describe, explain, and predict elements of classroom practice are naive and quite limited. So they see surface things. So they might look at obvious behavior or poor proxies. I think that's there's an interesting crossover with Rob Coe stuff around poor proxies. So the children look busy, so they must be busy. They must be learning well. The children are having great fun. They're engaged. They must be thinking really deeply. And it's very easy to see those things, but it's much harder to kind of get under the bonnet of them and start to think about what the impact of them of those things might have on learning. And through a series then of theory-based practice, so essentially learning about learning, and then in-school practice and mentoring and coaching, the teachers did the same activity again. So essentially over, I think it was around an 8-month period. And in 8 months, there was a huge kind of uplift in their ability to make sense of what they saw, essentially. So the kind of principle of that is that, yes, there's a challenge that teachers face in that we can't always see to begin with the things we need to see, but that doesn't mean that that's set in. We can work with that, and if we build our coaching around acknowledging as well as upskilling. So what I mean by that, I think is what Sarah Cottonhat and Hailey Hughes are talking about currently is concept case reasoning or coupling, concept case coupling. If you get a chance to hear them talk about that, it's really interesting. But it's essentially the essence of that is, do I understand the concept? So we've got to kind of add that theoretical cognitive element to what's happening. So we know more about the thing we're looking for. And then we can apply that to a case, which is essentially a medical term, like a scenario in which that we've encountered before. And we can make sense of it. We can draw on a similar case that we've experienced before, and we can use that as the basis of dealing with it in live in the moment. So the idea is that's what we see quite often, is that it's not just new teachers. Every teacher has pockets of novice observational practice. So it's hard to see things from the front of the class. It's hard to overcome the demands of being a teacher and managing 30 children at once and see all the things you need to see. But it can be coached. So it's making sure that the coaching processes that we build consider how do we up knowledge? So how do we build in the theory to build strong concept knowledge around the thing that we're working on? And then how do we enable the teacher to attach that concept knowledge to an action, a technique, to experience of actually doing that thing, to a mental model? And that enables then over time the teacher to build their noticing capacity as well. And the idea is, I suppose, that you want to have in the back of your mind this idea that ultimately, as a coach, my aim is to make myself redundant from the process. So if I'm coaching Kieran, I don't want Kieran to always need me there. I want ultimately Kieran to build his noticing ability and his repertoire of case knowledge so that he can respond to what he sees, so that he doesn't need me there. So I don't know if how that kind of correlates with your interpretation of Nick's ideas, but that's the way I see it currently.
Yeah, I think it does tie together. Nick was almost talking about, when you want to get the most out of a session or a sequence of sessions, if it comes from a place where the teacher's engaged with what's happening in their classroom, I think he described them as the problems they might be having, and they can be large or small. But if our ability to notice, as you sort of frame it, restricts our interpretation of the problems, that could be an issue. But actually, the way you've described it, I think makes total sense, because you can talk about, well, this is an issue for me, but we still need to have that level of expertise and those three component parts.
And this is where Charles Goodwin's work around professional vision comes in, actually. So one of the things that Charles Goodwin talked about is, how do we build professional vision? How do we... He uses lots of different domains as examples. He very rarely talks about teaching, actually, and which is why the Sturmer paper is quite interesting. But he kind of lays out some principles that are really, really useful, and I feel are really applicable to what the mechanisms of great coaching look like. So one of those is around highlighting key moments, right? So the example that Goodwin uses is archaeology. So he talks about archaeologists and how new archaeologists might be trained to see things in the soil that are almost imperceptible to the untrained eye. And it doesn't happen by accident, but what it requires sometimes is an expert archaeologist kind of signposting it. So putting a little flag marker in or pointing something out to somebody and saying, look at this, have a look and see how it's different here. And let's try and understand why it's different and how we recognize that and how we might do it next time. So there's this kind of cognitive apprenticeship approach to coaching, where it's right that we might not see things all the time. And even expert teachers will miss things because of the demands of being at the front of the classroom, running the class. So as a coach, what our job is to do is not to say, here's the thing I saw and that's the only thing that matters. It's like, let's have a look at what we've seen. What have you seen? And let's try and make sense of it. And this is what we think might be happening here. And so we're kind of coaching through that kind of gray area of, it's not about me telling you what I think of your lesson or what I think I saw. It's about us looking at the learners, looking at the learning that's happening and thinking about, what are we seeing here? How do we make sense of what we're seeing? What might we be missing here? And did you notice this? Or can we talk about this bit? And so we're not predetermining the thing that's going to happen. We're exploring it together. And I kind of refer to that as, that's what Goodwin refers to as cooperative action. But, the term I tend to use is around co-construction. So we're co-constructing meaning, we're sense making together. And that's an important part of it. But it works both ways as well. So, going back to kind of Nick's example there, is as a coach, yeah, you're right. Time is tight, that you might have limited amount of contact time with the teacher that you're working with. But it's so important that we work out where they are and what they know. It can't just be, we can't assume that they know it or they don't. We have to kind of start with them. So as a coach, I'm not sitting down with a teacher and saying, oh, that was great, this is what I saw. I'm thinking, right, let's really think hard about this moment here. Talk to me about what you see happening there. What are you noticing? And what I'm trying to do as a coach is work out, where is this teacher's awareness of the thing that's happening? What have they noticed and what haven't they noticed? You know, but also often from a subject specialist side, what's their rationale behind it? What's their intention? What do they intend to get out of this? And I like this idea of this triangulation of those things. It's like I'm triangulating in a coaching conversation the teacher's intention and design. This is what I wanted to happen, with their awareness of what they saw and what they noticed, with the reality of what was actually happening. I think that's a really useful kind of triangulation to kind of hold in mind as you're running coaching conversations. But it's that co-construction. So we're highlighting key moments, and we might do that by signposting things, or by asking mediative questions to kind of arrive at key areas, by taking an episodic approach. So we're focusing on individual moments, recognizing that those individual moments are only ever a very, very tiny tip of the iceberg in that teacher's practice. I think that's another important thing. So we have to that's where the dialogue is so important. We engage a teacher in dialogue, explore their intentions, explore what they've seen, what they've noticed, share insights. So it's okay for the coach to say, that was really interesting. Yeah. And I also noticed this. Did you see that? Did you notice that? What do we think about, what do you think is happening there? And that kind of exchange of insights, I think, is an important part of the dialogue there as well.
I think you're playing 4D chess with your triangulation, but you're checking for understanding, and that's potentially what they could be doing at the same time, but in a different context.
Yeah. But I mean, the key is it's not, there's nothing sinister but behind the scenes. It's like, we're doing it for the right reasons, and everybody knows what the reasons are. And yeah, I think it's right that I see so many coaching conversations or professional dialogue, professional learning exchanges that just bypass the teacher. It's just the coach or the senior leader just saying, oh, this is what I saw, this is what you did well, this is what I think the students were struggling, this is what you need to do next. And the teacher doesn't get a say in it. It doesn't, and then it just doesn't land. And so I think there's lots of reasons. I think even if it's just like manners, like good manners is, that's your classroom and you're in there all the time with that class, and I've just popped in for 10 minutes. It's not my place to tell you whether I thought it was any good or not. It's like, it's an anchor to practice. So I've come in and I've seen and I've watched, and I can make sense of some of the things that you're seeing, and we could talk about them because we were both in the room, but we've got to extrapolate it up into the general practice of the teacher as well. It can't stay at that kind of that 10-minute thing that I've seen. It's got to be a discussion, So, and that's what. That's what makes it cognitive. So we spoke earlier about everything tying in here. So when we speak about how do we develop professional vision, how do we develop a teacher awareness or their noticing ability, it's like, well, they have to get their head around what's happening. They have to know about it. Well, how do we teach them about it? Well, we have to talk about it. We have to discuss it. We can't just tell them. We have to ask questions that get them thinking hard about it. We need to mediate their thinking for them, hone in on some of the things that are really, really important if they've missed them. It's only then when if they don't think hard about it, nothing happens. Nothing changes. They go, no chance of thinking about, oh yeah, that's something I'm going to work on, because they just don't get it. It's just something that's kind of that somebody said to them once, as opposed to something that's going to be useful to them.